$2 trillion. That's how much flows between America and Europe every single year. And right now, that entire relationship is hanging by a thread. Here's what most people don't realize. When you think about America's biggest trading partner, you probably think China. Wrong. It's actually the European Union. And this partnership isn't just big, it's the largest bilateral trade relationship on the planet. Significant margin. But here's where it gets interesting. This relationship is surprisingly balanced. Both sides are sending out roughly the same as they're getting back, a genuine win-win, or at least it was supposed to be. So what changed? Over the last 12 months, everything got flipped upside down. Tariffs, threats, heated rhetoric aimed directly at EU members. The reasons range from protecting American industries to pushing geopolitical goals to, let's be honest, providing news cover for certain controversial documents. But here's what economists keep warning about. These tariffs don't just hurt America. Given how deeply connected these economies are, the risk to Europe is almost as great. And the terrifying part, Europe has very little control over it. This has forced European leaders to ask an uncomfortable question. How dependent are we on this increasingly unpredictable superpower? And more importantly, how dependent do we want to be going forward? So let's explore something massive. Could Europe actually sever this connection? And if they tried, what would it cost them? Because make no mistake, cutting off or even shrinking this relationship would be one of the biggest economic events in human history. And here's the brutal truth. It would be difficult during the best of times. But Europe isn't exactly having the best of times. Most major European economies are already struggling with their own problems. Attempting this kind of dramatic trade shakeup right now would be like trying to climb Mount Everest while on life support. Europe is just the canary in the coal mine of something much bigger. Over the last decade, the world has been slowly splitting into two camps. The West, centered around American financial systems and military protection, and the BRICS nations, informally rallying around China's industrial power. Here's the problem. Both team captains now come with serious geopolitical baggage, which raises an obvious question. Why don't these middle powers just work with each other? Why not avoid being bullied by the wild whims of either superpower? Sounds great in theory. But is it actually possible without crushing economic sacrifices for ordinary people? And here's another uncomfortable reality. In 3 years, 10 months, or even just one too many hamburgers, the entire political landscape might shift anyway. So let's dig into this. Could Europe and other global middle powers truly become independent of America and China? What sacrifices would that require? Could it happen within a realistic time frame? And what does all of this mean for countries caught in the middle? Not looking at anyone specifically, but I am looking specifically at the UK. To understand Europe's dependence on America, we have to understand how it got here, because this relationship was no accident. The Transatlantic Economic Partnership was deliberately engineered after World War II to counter communism and contain the Soviet Union. It started with the Marshall Plan in 1948. The United States provided $13 billion in economic aid to war-torn European allies and former enemies. The goal was simple: supply funding to rebuild private industry and public infrastructure, restore production, revitalize consumption. General George Marshall himself emphasized this was mutually beneficial. The consequences of war to America's economy, he said, should be apparent to all. But this wasn't charity, not even close. The plan came with conditions. Participating countries had to develop multilateral payment systems within Europe, move toward currency convertibility, ease import restrictions, increase exports to America. The deal also flooded Europe with US dollars, which solidified the dollar's role in global trade. And there was another consequence, maybe intended, maybe not. Economic growth brought political stability, which effectively killed communist influence across Western Europe. The plan worked spectacularly. 16 countries accepted funds, Germany, France, and the UK among the biggest recipients. Europe entered its fastest period of economic growth ever. By 1950, every participating country had matched or exceeded pre-war industrial production. But it did more than rebuild economies, it laid the foundation for NATO. It created the starting framework for what would become the European Union. America's post-war strategy had paid off brilliantly. What began as an industrial revitalization program morphed into a complex web of shared economic and geopolitical interests, all centered on the United States. The balance of global power had shifted firmly toward America. Like it or not, Europe had a new big brother. For decades, Europe thrived in America's shadow. Shared prosperity, mutual defense, everything seemed stable. But like many relationships, this one has hit a rocky patch. And Europe's contentment has created a dependency that's now being tested. So what happens next? Will these allies navigate this turbulent period and preserve the stability they've known for 70 years? Or will Europe need to fundamentally reimagine its role? To understand how painful a change might be, we first need to understand how deep this relationship really goes. While China remains the world's largest aggregate exporter, the US and EU have the largest multilateral trade relationship. Almost $2 trillion worth of goods and services cross the Atlantic every year. Here's how lopsided it looks. The EU exports over $545 billion in goods to America, more than double what they export to China. And they receive $365 billion from America, second only to imports from China. What's actually being traded? Europe sends heavy machinery, pharmaceuticals, and cars. America sends computers, phones, petroleum-based energy products, and chemicals. This isn't recreational shopping. These are foundational products that make both economies function. American factories depend on precision German machinery. Many of America's breakthrough medications come from Denmark. Meanwhile, Europe is heavily reliant on American energy, particularly liquefied natural gas and finished tech products. Now here's where the political spin comes in. Do the math on goods alone, and yes, America is running a massive trade deficit with Europe. Politicians point to this as proof that Europe is winning. They're selling more than they're buying. The scales aren't equal. But things aren't always what they seem. Remember that nearly $2 trillion figure? That includes goods and services. The deficit headlines only focus on physical goods, the stuff traveling in container ships. What's conveniently missing? Services. America is one of the world's largest service providers. Silicon Valley, the biggest tech companies on Earth, Wall Street, the finance titans. When you factor in technology licensing, intellectual property, digital advertising, and financial services, the picture changes dramatically. The EU actually has a services trade deficit of over $100 billion with America. View it holistically and the trade numbers become relatively balanced, much more palatable. Europe provides high-end machinery. America provides high-end tech and financial services. This is exactly how globalization is supposed to work. Countries lean into their strengths, specialize in what they do best, and trade with others who do the same. So why is the conversation still focused on goods? Because goods are tangible, easy to understand, and more importantly, they fit a particular narrative. Plus, there's a compelling argument that services can be replicated. With AI advancing rapidly, software and consulting could potentially be replaced. But you can't exactly vibe code your way out of needing liquefied natural gas. That's why America feels it has the upper hand. But we're still not done. Beyond goods and services, there's investment. The EU-US investment relationship is the largest in the world. It accounts for nearly 2/3 of all foreign investment in America. European companies don't just ship products across the Atlantic, they build factories and business hubs on American soil. Over 3 million US jobs are directly supported by EU investment. And it flows both ways. Despite narratives about money rushing to low-cost countries like Brazil, India, and China, Europe remains America's favorite investment destination. 2/3 of all US foreign investment over the last decade went to Europe. This isn't just trade. It's cross-border investments, international jobs, mixed markets, and shared consumers all woven together. And none of it would be possible without the financial infrastructure that makes global commerce work. SWIFT. Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It sounds boring, it's anything but. SWIFT is the global system that provides secure, standardized communication between financial institutions. It's essentially the nervous system of the global economy. Based in Brussels, sure, but the real keys to SWIFT are held firmly by America. Why? Because of the US dollar's dominance as the world's reserve currency. Most global trade is denominated in dollars. Almost every international transaction eventually touches the American financial system. Most SWIFT transactions clear through US banks. This gives America extreme influence over the entire world's finances. If America decides to sanction a bank, company, or country, there's an implicit threat. Any entity doing business with a sanctioned party risks being cut off themselves. SWIFT essentially becomes a tool of American foreign policy, denying access to avoid losing access to dollar markets. Once banned from SWIFT, an entity is locked out of global commerce. Payments, credit, fund transfers, settling obligations, all frozen. Economic activity paralyzed. This weapon was deployed against Russia after the Ukraine invasion, with devastating effect. The implications for Europe are profound. As long as Europe relies on infrastructure controlled by the US Treasury, they walk a delicate tightrope. Trade is increasingly weaponized on the geopolitical stage, and America is throwing its weight around. But how much negotiating power can the EU have against the country that controls their access to international commerce? True independence would require building financial infrastructure that doesn't need Washington's approval every time euros leave the continent. Europe wouldn't be the first to try. BRICS nations are developing their own cross-border payment system. China has CEPs. Russia created SPFS, but context matters. Russia's SPFS connects 124 financial institutions across 24 countries. SWIFT connects over 11,000 banks worldwide. Coordinating intercontinental exchanges at that scale is an enormous challenge. Developing a European version of SWIFT wouldn't be simple. It's ambitious. And it risks catching America's attention, potentially making an already tense situation worse. Maybe cryptocurrency and blockchain will eventually provide alternative pathways for international commerce, reducing reliance on SWIFT. They've spent the last year working to diversify. In January, the EU and major Latin American economies signed the Mercosur agreement. Free trade between 27 EU member states and Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. 25 years in the making, and they finally signed it. Presumably more eagerly now that their American partners are ramping up tariffs and threats. This agreement creates a massive open trading zone. Over 700 million people. Valued at more than 111 billion euros. Notably excluded, America and China. And Europe isn't alone in seeking alternatives. Across the Pacific sits the CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. 12 nations, including Japan, Australia, Canada, and the UK. Together, they represent the world's fourth largest free trading zone. 14.4% of global GDP, 7.7% of the world's population. As the traditional trade powers turn inward, interest in these middle power blocks keeps growing. Reports indicate the EU is exploring an economic alliance with the CPTPP in 2026. Canada has openly expressed willingness to facilitate it. If successful, nearly 40 nations and more than 1.5 billion people would come together in a single free trade agreement, without American or Chinese influence. So let's say Europe actually decides to pursue independence. They shift away from America and lean into these new Latin American and Pacific alliances. Who gets hurt the worst? When we talk about the European Union, we're actually talking about 27 independent nations. A break would be painful for all, but trade and economic production aren't spread evenly across the continent. Neither would be the burden. The short answer, Germany. Germany sits firmly as Europe's economic hub. But in this scenario, their position becomes precarious. Germany is the world's third largest exporter, behind only China and America. Their economy is highly dependent on exports, with nearly 50% of manufactured goods shipped abroad. Germany also happens to be the single largest exporter to the United States. Not a comfortable position if relations go south. Total German exports to America exceed 180 billion annually, more than 10% of their total trade. Imports from America are half that. Their economic system depends far more on America than America depends on them. The famous German Mittelstand makes this even more complicated. The backbone of German industry consists of small to medium enterprises that dominate global niche markets. Highly specialized companies often focused on single products like precision machinery. And precision machinery happens to be Germany's primary export to America, followed closely by cars. This specialization is Germany's greatest strength that accounts for nearly 20% of GDP. But in a trade war or sudden separation, it becomes a critical vulnerability. The German Mittelstand functions because of access to global markets, particularly American customers. Close those doors and you get unemployment, a dramatic GDP drop, and a desperate scramble for new partners. Not to mention sudden shortages of energy and pharmaceuticals they source from America. But Germany isn't alone in their exposure. The United States and Ireland share deep social and economic ties. Nearly 1 in 10 Americans is of Irish descent. Boston is recognized as the most Irish city in the world outside Ireland. But the relationship goes beyond heritage. America is Ireland's largest trading partner by far. Nearly 1/3 of all Irish exports go to America, including services. Nearly 40% of Irish imports come from America. Because of pro-business policies, low corporate taxes, an English-speaking workforce, and EU access, Ireland has become America's economic foothold in Europe. Much of America's pharmaceutical and tech industries launch their European operations from Irish shores. America is the largest source of foreign investment in Ireland and a prime driver of their economy. But Ireland invests heavily in America too. They're the 5th largest source of foreign investment in the US. 781 Irish companies operate in America, employing more than 200,000 Americans across all 50 states. For America's investment, nearly 1,000 US companies operate in Ireland. They directly employ 245,000 people and indirectly support another 169,000. The numbers of companies and employees look roughly equal, but the economic impact isn't. America's population exceeds 340 million. Ireland's is closer to 5.5 million, smaller than New York City. U.S. investment in Ireland accounts for nearly 15% of Ireland's total workforce. U.S. investment in Ireland accounts for nearly 15% of Ireland's total workforce. And it gets more complicated. Most Irish imports from America are intermediate goods and services, intellectual property, and R&D that enable production of finished goods like high-end medications. These are primarily intended for export elsewhere, including back to America. Many Irish workers employed by U.S. companies work in high-end pharma and tech. They're among the country's highest-paid citizens. While Ireland's economy looks strong on paper, much of it is essentially a pass-through for American multinationals. It masks the country's true reliance on this relationship. Ireland benefits from jobs, higher wages, and a higher tax base from employees and corporations. Every year, a significant portion of U.S. company profits are recorded in Ireland, funding a large portion of Irish government revenue. But this creates a dangerous dependency. If the relationship frays, Ireland faces massive unemployment and a sudden swing from budget surplus to deficit. The entire economy would need structural transformation. No easy task. And the ripple effects don't stop there. A breakup or trade war with America would impact the entire continent. The core problem is simple. Right now, Europe needs America more than America needs Europe. America supplies more than 1/4 of EU gas imports, a problem made worse by banning Russian imports. But Europe is learning that trading reliance on one country for another comes with its own costs. And America remains the largest advanced consumer market in the world. That's the core of the current administration's argument. Want access to our customers? Pay a fee. Who actually pays that fee remains debatable. Under the current administration, America is aggressively trying to bring manufacturing home. Companies face tax incentives and political pressure to invest domestically. Yes, America relies on Europe for specialized machinery. Yes, US corporations enjoy tax advantages through countries like Ireland. But these aren't existential issues for America. They have the means to invest in and build specialized manufacturing. US companies can operate from home, even at higher tax rates. Europe doesn't have that luxury. Their high-end industries rely on American customers, and there are few alternatives. India focuses on low-end production. China is similar, but also a competitor with its own geopolitical baggage. Russia is effectively off limits. There simply isn't high demand for advanced machinery and sophisticated pharmaceutical development in the rest of the developing world. Plus, Europe isn't just buying American products. The relationship has created efficiencies through trade, shared technology, and labor, economies of scale and specialization that neither side could achieve alone. But most modern tech innovation originates in America. A clean cut would mean rebuilding the American tech stack from scratch. At a time when many EU countries are already struggling with debt and deficits. So let's be clear, a voluntary clean break isn't probable. It might be impossible unless economic catastrophe is the goal. A realistic transition would be slow, still painful, and would bring higher prices, lower productivity, and technological regression. What's also clear to European leaders is this. They need to decrease dependence on America, move towards self-reliance, a de-risking strategy. And the transition needs to start now. It already has. In January, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen delivered a special address at the World Economic Forum in Davos. She called the seismic changes happening today an opportunity, in fact, a necessity to build a new form of European independence. She outlined a vision to reposition Europe as a global diversified trading partner, initiatives to make the EU less bureaucratic and more business-friendly. She's not alone. European leaders are increasingly aware of their vulnerabilities. Comfort in the status quo is no longer a luxury. For over 80 years, Europe enjoyed implicit protection from America and its massive military budget. Another point of contention for the current administration, which claims Europe has been getting a free ride on US defense spending. On this, the pressure is working. For the first time in years, Europe has begun massive remilitarization, partly due to American pressure, partly responding to renewed Russian aggression. The problem? Reaching NATO defense spending targets is a heavy lift for stagnating, deficit-ridden European economies. Balancing current budgets while stimulating growth is already hard enough. There's something to be said for boosting the industrial base with domestic defense spending, especially when trying to fuel job growth in high-tech industries at home. But military spending as stimulus is highly inefficient. It's money spent on products that provide no downstream economic benefit. The economy doesn't actually grow beyond the single products produced, particularly problematic for countries needing to maximize every euro. And it's not really optional anyway. America is downplaying NATO's importance. They're saber-rattling about annexing Greenland with threats of trade war in force. While war is highly improbable, what could Europe actually do? A hot or cold war over Greenland would be disastrous. Europe could lose swift access, international commerce, military protection, and $2 trillion of trade simultaneously. If it wasn't clear before, it's crystal clear now. Power politics are back, and some Europeans refuse to remain powerless. French President Macron made this explicit in recent speeches. He told the Munich Security Council that Europe must learn to become a geopolitical power. He recently emphasized the point with powerful words and dramatic visuals. Standing before a Triomphant-class ballistic missile submarine, Macron announced a new era for France's role in Europe. As the EU's only nuclear power, France plans to increase its nuclear arsenal for the first time in modern history. They intend to deploy nuclear weapons in allied countries across the continent. Macron stated boldly, "To be free, we have to be feared." His sentiment is echoed by other leaders. Europe's transformation extends beyond military matters. Von der Leyen calls for a stronger single EU market. Governments are moving public officials off American communication platforms. They're diversifying energy suppliers, investing in European AI initiatives, developing non-US payment processing platforms. The slow shift has officially begun. Times have changed. Europe is deliberately choosing to strengthen itself as a bloc, to establish power, to claim their seat at the table. They refuse to be reclassified as a middle power in this shifting world order. After all, they've had a front row seat to watch what happens when that occurs. Their former partner, the UK, left the European Union in 2020. Focused on newfound ability to negotiate their own trade deals, right as the world started turning more insular. Talk about timing. Beyond the direct economic consequences of leaving the EU, Britain essentially stepped off their team to negotiate alone in a game that favors collective bargaining. While the EU has collective weight to push back on American tariffs, the UK must negotiate one-on-one. The chips aren't stacked in their favor. There's no debate about who's the junior partner in a UK-US relationship. Yes, they joined the Pacific-based CPTPP, but that's proving more symbolic than substantive. The UK finds itself alone on an island in a world of consolidating power blocks, and they're starting to regret it. The British public and politicians miss the EU. They're working toward a reset in the relationship, but it's off to a shaky start. Will Britain be the first casualty of this new world order, or will they forge ahead independently with new or old partners? Only time will tell. Speaking of time, everything happening right now stems from the current US administration. Will any of this even matter in 3 years? As economists, we like to pretend we're above politics, but inevitably one influences the other, and it's clear that politics has changed this economic relationship. The current era of trade wars, tariffs, and threats isn't what most Americans want. It's the prerogative of President Trump and his cabinet. With his party in power, that prerogative has met little effective political resistance. For now, it increasingly looks like the administration may lose significant power in the 2026 midterm elections. Voters are struggling with tariffs, affordability, and various foreign policy decisions, but nothing is certain. If anyone can defy polls, it's Donald Trump. However, the US political system often swings like a pendulum. Reactionary shifts from one end of the political spectrum to the other every few years. After all, a president can only serve 2 terms. Europe's bold independence steps, the remilitarization, energy diversification, homegrown tech development, new payment infrastructure, the Mercosur agreement, will likely take years to pay off. By the time these efforts mature, America might have a new administration, one that wants to be best friends again. But the die has been cast. Europe has glimpsed what their worst nightmares could look like. In a world of escalating geopolitical tensions, they can no longer assume America will always have their back. They shouldn't assume it. Hopefully, the relationship improves. But either way, if Europe can successfully establish itself as a more independent bloc, stepping into their role as a global power, they'll approach future relationships as equals, not junior partners. For the middle powers currently caught in this shifting global landscape, the lesson is unmistakable. The status quo is no longer guaranteed, and dependency has become a liability. That's all for today. I will be making similar video in the future. Subscribe to see them.